yeah, one of the great things about Grit, because I did a piece on him as well, and we're on Facebook Live right now that you speak, the bogus pass interference. He actually talks about it. He doesn't think he lost that game for him. He was like, let me tell you something. Corny Salaveda said same play in the huddle at the goal line, and then he ran another play all on his own, and he laughs about that. But I do know that, because I talked to John Robert Bell, who's a local coaching legend, Dave, and I'll tell you about him sometime. Bill Curry said he was the best coach he ever had. Bill Curry played for, let me tell you who these guys are. Let's see here. Vince Lombardi, Don Shula, Chuck Knoll, Chuck Knox, Bear Bryant, Bobby Dodd, and Don McCafferty. John Robert Bell is the guy he credits as the best coach he ever had. So think about that for a second. Yeah. But they had, but anyway, Bell was a very kind man. Was that they were very much, the students at Georgia Tech burned Governor Griffith's in effigy. There was this, we're going to play this game. That's no way, and Griffiths actually was on the sideline for Georgia Tech because he couldn't, they said, come out and say, oh, well, I guess I was wrong and all that. But that was his unspoken way of almost saying, and this is what Bell told me, his unspoken way of how he could say, I was, wrong, and okay, I'm changing my mind without saying it, which we can discuss whether or not, that's enough. But I do think at the times it was something of a powerful statement. Anyway, we'll go on here. Let's see here. Hey, I'm talking to a pretty good sports historian on Tri-City Sports Now. His name is David Finoli. He's just written a book. It's called Kings of the Bluff, which normally wouldn't interest a whole lot of people around here because it's on the history of a kind of the yesterday's basketball program. The Duquesne Dukes, who last won, they were ranked number one in 1955, or I guess it was 52. They were ranked number one. Won the NIT. This is how long ago it is, when the NIT was on an equal footing with the NCAAs in 1955. But we're talking about tomorrow, 71 years ago to the day. Duquesne was supposed to play Tennessee. Tennessee refused to play them because Chuck Cooper was on the roster of the Duquesne Dukes, and Cooper would become the first African-American to be drafted by the National Basketball Association. So when you look back at this, Dave Finoli, yourself, I've got to think, okay, we've come a long way. Even, here in East Tennessee, some of the communities that were segregated, let's just say, even a generation after Martin Luther King, now because of farm labor and such, are now more diverse than they ever have been, or at least have been in recent history, this sort of thing. When you look back at this, it's, a tragedy, but you also say how far we have come. And I guess I open-ended question, but, how far do you think we have come in these 71 years since Tennessee said, we're not playing them? They have a black player on their team. My goodness, we can't do that. How far do you think we have come?
Well, I mean, as the 60s went through, and reading about Coach Bear Bryant with Alabama, really had always wanted to integrate in the 60s. But as the 60s came, or the end of the 60s came, the Southeastern Conference really dropped their aversion to recruiting African-American players. At Tennessee, you see the great Conridge Holloway, who was a favorite of mine growing up. Just a tremendous all-around quarterback. He was fast. He had a decent arm. Ended up being a Canadian Football League Hall of Famer. He certainly wasn't a tall quarterback by any stretch, but he was a guy that basically Tennessee embraced, and he was one of the pioneers in my eyes as the 70s were starting to unfold. And today, I mean, it's not even a thought. it's the Southeastern Conference, as just every other conference in the country, recruits regardless of race or any other prejudice, and certainly it's come light year. I mean, in the 1950s, I don't think they could have imagined where the Southeastern Conference was at this point today. So I would say that the change has been remarkable over the years, and certainly a lot of it comes to honor the stars, and just like the stars of Tennessee, the Reggie Whites and Conridge Holloway, Bernard King, who certainly was a phenomenal player with the Knicks. So certainly those pioneers helped foster integration, and today it's not even a thought.
And yeah, I mean, T. Martin leads the Vols to the national championship. Josh Dobbs, very much, talked about in such glowing terms here recently. We're talking to Dave Finoli. He's an author of a lot of sports history books and all this, and he uncovered the story of when the Tennessee Volunteers refused to play a game because they had a black player on the other team. And you mentioned, about Conridge Holloway. It also should be said that I think to this day, Holloway, there's a big tradition at Neyland Stadium where the football team runs through the tee. The band makes a formation on the field before the game in a tee, and the Tennessee Volunteers run out of the locker room and through the tee. And always the last person who just walks right behind the Vols is actually Conridge Holloway. Almost 45 years after he last played and such. So, he still has a big part in Tennessee history as well. But I know in your book, Kings of the Bluff, I read also that, you mentioned that Bob Neyland was strangely silent over this whole incident. And I'd like you to kind of elaborate on this. There was never, you didn't find anything from Neyland talking about the entire incident whatsoever, is what you're telling me.
Basically, which again was surprising at the time. Not that General Neyland was outwardly a prejudiced man, but it seemed like, from what I read, there was extreme disappointment, and I think that's an understatement of what Duquesne had done in the Tennessee papers and such. And there was support for Maurer sticking to his guns, except from the great football coach, General Neyland, who I thought it was just odd that, with all these support going on for what he did, but the great coach of the Tennessee Volunteers remained silent. To me, that was something of, I'm not sure that you were right in doing that kind of reaction. But again, I'm just assuming because there was nothing really said about it. But I just thought that was a little odd.
Now, the other thing that I found in reading your research and such, and for that matter, the newspaper articles you sent me, written by a sports writer by the name of Jack Sell, who actually covered Bob Seifers from Kingsport for many years when Seifers played for the Steelers. But I would, and Seifers, a legendary Tennessee Volunteer and Dobbins Bennett Indian who led the nation in scoring in 1938. Okay, so that's Bob Seifers. But I would point this out that he made mention in the game that on how this came out, and leading up to the game, there was, I guess Milo didn't even really know the name of Chuck Cooper. He wasn't familiar with the roster. He misidentified him, and it sent a few overtures out to Duquesne saying, now, what's your roster going to be? What's your roster going to be? And Duquesne kind of was like handling it in a way of, well, we're not going to tell you because, we're going to force you to make a move almost here, and we're going to try to force you to do the right thing is the way that I came and thought of it. But tell us a little bit about that. I mean, obviously there aren't film exchanges in 1946. You don't go on TV and see on ESPN, and do a little bit of scouting right there. Tell us about the procedures before the game and the interactions between Duquesne and John Milo at Tennessee.
Well, Duquesne, Chuck Cooper was just a freshman. He had gone to West Virginia State before the war. I believe it was West Virginia State. But he had gone there. It was one of the historic tremendous teammate,
Mm-hmm.
one who wasn't looking for the spotlight. So it would have been easy for Duquesne just to sit him. Now, Maurer had claimed he had sent, well, he didn't claim, he did, it was verified. He did send a note, not knowing the guy's name at the time, as you said, kind of botching that up. And Davies kind of just sent it off to his manager, Jack Davis, the graduate manager of athletics. And they claimed that they didn't quite understand what Maurer was saying, but, I mean, I can't believe that for any sense of the imagination. In my mind, it was Duquesne figured, okay, you're going to get on a plane, you're going to want your cut. If you come here, we're assuming you're not going to want to leave here empty-handed. So they were playing a little bit of a gamble. They kept saying they just thought he was inquiring about the team. They didn't know he wouldn't play. He didn't say he wouldn't play. Maurer vehemently denied that and said he was very clear about it. But Duquesne chose to ignore it and not respond to him. So Maurer was assuming that since Claire B did it at Long Island, at Madison Square Garden, that he just assumed Duquesne wouldn't play. Now, Chick Davies, when push comes to shove, Maurer learns that, in fact, Duquesne intends on playing this guy and tells Davies, they're not going to take the court. Davies actually offers, which, again, shows maybe it wasn't a strong, we're going to play him or else, claims we'll only play him if we need him. Again, Cooper not being the star he would eventually turn out to be. But it was the guy who was in charge of the Duquesne Athletic Council, the Judge Sam Weiss, who was the one who was vehement, we're either going to play with Cooper or we're not going to play.
Sure.
So to me, it was more or less a gamble by Duquesne, hoping that the pressure of taking the flight, because Tennessee did not get paid, did not get a thin dime from this. So basically, the travel up and the travel back were on Tennessee's bill there, so to speak. So it was quite a gamble from Duquesne, and I'm sure they didn't expect Maurer to back down the way he did.
Yeah, John Myler, I know, is in several local sports Hall of Fames. I looked the name up after reading your piece, Kings of the Bluff. We're talking to Dave Finoli. He's a sports historian, and really, uncovered or wrote a bit in his new book, Kings of the Bluff, which doesn't necessarily have a Tennessee interest, except that this one story about 71 years ago tomorrow, where the Vols refused to play the first black player ever drafted by the NBA. It is a long time ago. I mean, this is only 8 years, this incident, 8 years after basketball, they quit jumping the ball after every basket. I mean, this is a long ago era. We do get that. But in that long ago era, the NIT and the NCAA tournament kind of had equal footing. Now, I know that a lot of Southern teams, I believe, actually did go to the NIT back in those times because, and correct me if I'm wrong, I know that a lot of SEC teams, if you look at their history, you don't see them making the NCAA tournament until the 60s and 70s because a lot of the SEC teams did not want to play teams with black players, which is amazing. And instead they would go to the NIT. But, the NIT didn't have a segregational ban or anything. How was that possible? Why would teams possibly go to the NIT but not the NCAAs?
Well, back then, Duquesne actually, over the course of 16 years, turned down the NCAAs many times for a loyalty they had to the NIT, even though they were one of the top 3-4 teams in the country. The NCAA back then was very restrictive. You had to win your conference, and they only allowed one team per conference. Now, back then, I would say it's safe to say 60 to 70% of the schools that played major college basketball were independents. So you found that most of these independents also would turn down bids to the NCAA, whether it be the joy of going to Madison Square Garden for a 3-4 day tournament, or just the fact that the NIT didn't have the restrictions that the NCAA had. I mean, how many times does the second or third the fact the NIT was willing to go out and recruit these great independent teams, take some of the secondary teams from the conferences that oftentimes might have been, at the end of the year, might have been the best team in the conference. So arguably until the end of the 50s, the NIT was the better was the better tournament of the two.
And I know that it was very heavily, a lot of times Catholic schools like Duquesne, like LaSalle, would play in the NIT. There was some favoritism. It also, with the NIT in that era, because I believe the NCAA at that time was played on campus sites and all over the country, but the NIT was at that time always played the entire tournament in Madison Square Garden. So if I'm an NBA team, it's very easy for me to scout the NIT. I just go to New York, plan that schedule, and say, oh, here's the top teams in basketball. Tom Nola, let's play for the hometown Philadelphia Warriors, that sort of thing. And the NCAA would have been more costly to scout, this sort of thing. So you look at that. On the other hand, I do want to point this out. I have noticed that the NCAA tournament winner almost always was ranked in the final poll higher than the NIT winner. I mean, CCNY 1950 won them both. We know that. But just for an example, 1955, the team that you wrote about, they finished fourth in the poll. San Francisco with Bill Russell, won the NCAAs, and they were ranked number one. So is it really, I mean, how do you maintain that the NIT, I mean, I can see strong tournament back then, something other than we're number 69, but what is your argument that it was the superior tournament from the day?
Well, if you look at the depth of the tournament, the NCAA, yes, it would get a couple in the top, but in 1955, as an example, it also had two teams, names escape me at this point, but there were two teams who not only were under 500 that they invited, it was an at-large bid, but they were significantly. I believe Oklahoma A&M, which was Oklahoma State eventually, was one of them. But the depth of the tournament was such that you were top heavy. But if you look down, and I break it down in the book, there were more top 20 teams in the NIT that year than in the NCAAs.
Okay.
So it might have been easier for a San Francisco to run the table on a tournament like that than an NIT, where every game you're really going against a top quality opponent. And I do make the claim that Duquesne played a much tougher schedule, and when they had Ricketts and Green, which were their two stars in the lineup, they were unbeaten. It was only when they were injured that they lost their 3 or 4 games.
Okay, Dave Finoli, I got Ken Pomeroy warming up in a bullpen here, so I got to ask you here to come out. You've got a lot of books on Amazon. Kings of the Bluff is one of your latest works, but for a Tennessee interest, what book have you written? Because I know you got about 12 of them out there. Do you think might have the most interest to a Tennessee audience?
I would say, the other 20-some are about Western Pennsylvania, but for Tennessee, my first book, For the Good of the Country, is about baseball during World War II, how it played out in the country. A lot of Tennessee influence in there, and a lot of Southern influence in there. And it's just a book that really portrays a baseball society where the best players in the league, 75% of them, would go off to serve for their country. Some, like Bob Feller, getting in actual battle, and Ted Williams. Mm-hmm. So that's, to me, my favorite book that I've done. It's the first book I did, and I think it's a book that certainly baseball fans anywhere, including Tennessee, would really enjoy.
And check them out, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. David Finoli, thanks for joining us and showing us how far we've come in 71 years on Tri-City Sports Now. Ken Pomeroy coming up. Can the SoCon get 2 bids in the NCAAs? That's what we'll be asking Tri-City Sports Now. Okay. All right. I hope you enjoyed that.